Bom dia ao que estão no Brasil.
Good morning to those in Brazil. Good evening to our colleagues in China, and good morning to my colleague Guilherme Bastos, Secretary of Agricultural Policies of Ministry of Agriculture. I'm Luiz Augusto,
Presidente do Conselho Empresarial Brasil-China. Gostaria de
Business
dar
Council, and I'd like to welcome all of you on the second dialogue Brazil-China on sustainable agriculture, which comes from a partnership between the Brazil-China uh, Business Center in the Chinese IFS, the Sustainability Farming Institute, headed by Bajin, that I thank for the opportunity of being here. In behalf of CBC, I'd like to officially thank Bayer, the sponsor of the second dialogue, Brazil-China, on sustainable agriculture. And today's event is a continuity of the dialogue we've had mid-2021, where the conclusions were used for the document of CSBC called Sustainability and Technology as basis for the cooperation between Brazil and China. Launched in October, it has supplied subsidized or inputs for the sixth meeting of the Brazil-China high-level
a COSBAN, realizada em maio deste ano.
held in May this year. Many of the suggestions of CBC were reflected in the document that were shown in that conference, which is the main discussion mechanism between the governments of Brazil and China. In the second edition of this dialogue, CBC and IFS intend to widen the discussions on the low carbon agriculture funding in Brazil. As it was said, in the past, the president of the IFS, by June, and investors, they have resources to apply on the sector. They only lack access to. With the dialogue, we expect to contribute for this gap of knowledge to reduce. And it's important to remind that China fosters a lot of the exports for the Brazilian agribusiness. And Brazil is the main food exporter to China. And so we have the inescapable fact that the sustainability is present in this relationship. So we have the new instruments of green finance and the challenges and opportunities for the low carbon agriculture funding. In ways to find forms of cooperation and promotion of connections between Chinese investors and Brazilian producers. Today's event will have simultaneous interpretation for Portuguese, Chinese, and English. You may activate that in the bar below the icon interpretation, and you can pick the language of your convenience. I pass the floor now to the Secretary of Agricultural Policies of the Ministry of Agriculture of Brazil, Guilherme Bastos. You have the floor, sir. Yes. Perfect. Well, Ambassador, thank you very much. Good morning to you all. First and foremost, I'd like to congratulate the Brazil-China Business Council and the Institute for Finance and Sustainability for the organization of the second edition of the Brazil-China Dialogue on Sustainable Agriculture. This has been a year of intensification of the cooperation between Brazil and China. In just last May, we had the sixth meeting of the Brazil-China connection or COSBAN, headed by the presidents of our countries. And in the scope of COSBAN, we reached important advances in agriculture, even increasing the market opening, the creation of the work group for the cooperation agriculture, digital agriculture, which is a very important theme related to the promotion of sustainability. We've also had the 14th BRICS Summit, where our presidents decided to strengthen the cooperation practically in all fields, and it is on that spirit that we continue the dialogue on sustainable agriculture and green finance as important basis of the strategic partnership between Brazil and China. Here, as the Secretary for Agricultural Policies, it is with great pleasure that I see the theme of the financing and sustainable agriculture. It has an important area in this in the agenda of this event. We saw in Brazil the launch in last June, the launch of our agricultural funding plan called Safra Plan, and we have strengthened the financing of initiative of sustainable initiatives rather, especially close to our low carbon agriculture ABC plus. For the Safra Plan, the ABC program, which is linked to the ABC plan, was has been allocated 6.9 billion reais. 1 billion reais more than the previous year. And this is the largest volume allocated for this program with the lowest interest rates made available for the investors in the SAFA plan from 7 to 8.5% a year. We included the SAFA plan as expenses the maintenance of legal reservations and permanent preservation areas. Before, it was only possible to fund or to finance the restoration and recovery of those areas. We also widened the limit of this funding for costs for expenses and for the ones that had the rural registry. Well, this is a way to foster the producers to advance in this important environmental uh, regularization. In fact, well, we have the support to the mid-size rural producer pronounce and the general investment credit, the possibility of funding for the implementation of systems for the generation distribution of energy produced from renewable sources for their own consumption, and also the funding for 100% in the scope of Moderfrota, the program to acquire machinery, tractors, sprays or pulverizers that use as fuel the biomethane, and Mother Frota funds over 85% of this amount. In along general lines, the sustainability of these programs and practices financed by the SAFRA plan, there was also assessed by the CBI, by the climate bond initiative, showing that the volume of resources allocated to the SAFRA plan for investment are not restricted to the ABC program. The estimates is that almost 60% of the loans for investment have been directed to the practices that promote environmental improvement or restoration. So we're open to discuss opportunities for the widen of the co-financing for green agriculture. And I'm certain this event is a great opportunity for us to advance towards that direction. Dear friends, the cooperation between Brazil and China in the sector of sustainable agriculture becomes more and more important for the current scenario that issues that affect the global food security. So with that, I'd like to thank the organizers for the initiative and I'd like to stress the support of the Ministry of Agriculture, and I wish you all a great event and we will continue now. Thank you.
Bom dia, muito obrigado. Agradeço
Good
muito.
day. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank Guilherme Bastos for his kind words, and I'd like to invite the Vice President of IFS, my to present and moderate. Mayuan, Bayuan, you have the floor.
好，谢谢
I'd like to thank all the words of Dr. Bastos, and I'll start the first panel, and I come from the Beijing Institute. My name is Bai. So let's introduce the speakers. We have Majun, Sean Kidney, Ana Lucia, Rodrigo, and José, Ângelo. They will be the speakers of this first round. As we have we're restricted on time, so I'd like kindly ask the speakers to control the time and do not go above 7 or 8 minutes. The first one to speak, Dr. Ma Jin, is the president of the IFS from Beijing. Ma Jin. First and foremost, I'd like to thank the organizer, Ambassador Castro Neves, and Secretary Bastos, our dear colleagues, good morning and good evening to everyone. It is an honor for the IFAS to organize together with CBC this second edition of the dialogue Brazil-China towards sustainable agriculture. Last year, we had the presence of the Minister of Agriculture as a display of support, as a show of support, and to open this communication platform. And we have different think tanks that are gathered here today in this space. Thank you very much for the kind words of the authorities from Brazil. And I'd like to thank the presence of our colleagues that come from banks and financial institutions, academia, to discuss innovation on the financing of sustainable activities. Tomorrow we'll have the second day of discussions. So we have 2 days of work. 2 years ago, IFS was focusing on the research on credit for sustainable production. And throughout those 2 years, we have been deepening our research. And Brazil is a great partner in this area with China, great exporter for soybeans and beef for China or meat for China. In 2021, the soy exports from Brazil to China represented around 70% of the Brazilian soy. And the meat export, the Chinese market represents about 1/4 of its whole meat production, and the value of these products in the Chinese market has increased. And so we'll discuss how the financial area may enter this game. What is the role with their financial innovative products for risk assessment in this new scenario? That brings, of course, challenges with climate change. It brings challenges to the world and even for us in the financial sector. We are facing the loss of biodiversity, and that also increases the risk for agriculture. If we cannot effectively stop the climate change, it will bring even more damage or harming influences or issues for the financial for the world population in the agricultural production. In China, facing this climate change and the crisis,
already counts on a number of documents with the guidance and different measures. And IFS, the institution I'm working on, in IFS, we have a working group dedicated to study and analyzing how China may develop a sustainable economy. Last year in November, we had a good result. We came up with an index for agriculture and good practices for the sector. So we have several different practices, and we have published the list and the index, and it's already circulating, and it's already present abroad. And then we also had a meeting, the UN meeting on climate change on ISB with the new parameters. We intend to establish a world index of practices. So good practices related to biodiversity and climate change, and all of these factors will start to be a part of the financial sector as factors to influence the composition of the different products. In addition to that, last year in G20, in the G20 roadmap, there was a working group that had its results recognized in terms of biodiversity and good practices in biodiversity. So they research biodiversity and come up with ideas on how the different sectors can affect biodiversity. That there's a presence of experts from Brazil and from China in this group. And being China and Brazil, two countries that are very large in size, with also large volumes of exports in agricultural production, these are very significant countries for the facing of the climate change challenge. And from the financial sector, we from Brazil and China may share experiences and talk about our experiences. And we may also develop cooperations and joint projects and products so that those ideas may become concrete products. And this is the second or third time that we meet. And in the previous occasion, we invited other specialists and people who work in the sector to talk about their viewpoints. The aim is to share about innovations, about the rules, and what we have installed for the future. So I'll give the floor back to our moderator. With that, I close my participation. Thank you, Mr. Mai. I know that our time is very limited. I can see some questions on the chat, but I'll leave them to the end. We have next Mr. Sean Kidney.
Thank you for the chance to speak. And thank you for the chance
co-founder and
to come after my good friend, Dr. Mazzilo, who's been the pioneer of green finance. I mean, with a collective of people, of course, in China. It's an honor, always an honor to speak after him. You know, we have, as Mazzilo said, an incredible challenge ahead of us. We're seeing the beginning of climate impacts happening around the world now, whether that be floods or heat in China, or whether it be the changing agricultural patterns that we're starting to see in Brazil, or snow in southern Brazil last year. I mean, what's going on here? Of course, what's going on is climate change. It's underway right before our very eyes. There is an urgency. It's been driven home by the pandemic, which after all is about the collapse of biodiversity and the relevant impact on species, pathogens jumping between species. It's linked to climate change, folks. The Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change has been warning us of a century of pandemics for the last 30 years, and this is the first one that got away. There'll be many more impacts to our economies and our societies coming through, starting now, not in 2050, starting now. So there's an urgency. But I don't want to talk about urgency. I want to talk about opportunity, because for me, there's an extraordinary opportunity around sustainability between China and Brazil. I mean, we have on one side of the equation, China, which is now the engine of the world economy. It is the economy that whenever we teeter on the edge of depression, reflates the world economy, as it did in 2008, 2015, 2020, with massive stimulus, and gets things going again. And it has become so large, it is a critical part, essential part. Frankly, it's the driver economy of the planet. For Brazilian agri-producers that are trying to market there, this is incredibly important, right? This is extraordinary opportunity for market growth, which I don't think has been adequately grasped yet, especially because of the second point I want to raise, the appetite in China for sustainability. Amongst the coastal provinces, the richer parts of China and so on, the appetite for clean and green is so powerful, so strong. I call it the New Zealand effect. You know, New Zealand is a quality brand when it comes to food produce, for example. Ever since we had the problems with powdered milk many years ago, this has grown. Brazil has the opportunity to be the same thing, has the opportunity to be the top class, and I'm going to say the value-added brand. So not just commodity supply of soy for pig farms, that's one business. What's much more interesting is commodity supply, high-value produce for the richer consumers in Shanghai and Shenzhen and Beijing. That's where I think we have, you know, just so much we can be doing together. That's what I'd like to say. But there is another thing to say about China too. China, of course, has become a leader in green finance. And thanks to the work of Dr. Mazzilo and his friends at the People's Bank of China and so on, we have now the world's largest or second largest green bond market, depending on how you count it, not to mention a vast sustainable loan market. Regulators actively pushing changes. We've just had the publication a few days ago of the China Green Bond Principles, another step in the change. We have appetite for investment in green. In other words, not only can Brazil look to diversify sales for agribusiness, sustainable green agribusiness, but it could also look to diversify access to capital in agribusiness. I say that because there's been, let's just say, some debate in Brazil about equity versus that selling the farm kind of idea. We understand that. I mean, to be honest, we have the same discussion in China, where there is a reticence to sell off things to overseas country, as in most developing and emerging markets and growing markets. But debt is a different matter. Debt is a different matter. It's not selling the ownership of the vehicle, it's raising capital. There is a really healthy, growing debt market, extraordinarily successful green debt market in Brazil, which we can tap. And we have a third thing, which is going for us, which is around support, because we have institutions that are willing to be the bridge here. We do have the New Development Bank, a fantastic institution where the executive are talking about how green they want to be and how important sustainability is going forward. We can use that to try and broker, to support. We've got the Agricultural Development Bank of China, which is an incredible leader in developing sustainable finance. We've worked with them in the past, again, with Dr. Mazzilo, who are looking for ways of growing their business, and the commercial banks, such as Agricultural Bank of China, but also in Brazil, BNDES, Banco do Brasil, who've now got substantial sustainable finance programs. And of course, my favorite Brazilian institution, the Banco Central do Brasil, that has now got a really important program of supporting sustainable agriculture. The relationships that we can build between these institutions and then between private sector operations in China and Brazil, I think it's a well that is very, very deep. There's so much we can be doing. And for Brazil, I think this is really critically important, because we have the opportunity here to substantially diversify our sales efforts. Now, of course, we're making a lot of money now in Brazilian agribusiness thanks to the Ukrainian war. Food prices are very high. There's a temptation to say, hey, things are going fantastic. Why should I do anything? Commodity booms don't last, especially when they're bare commodity booms. We need to use the commodity boom we're having now to shift in Brazil to higher value product, to product that'll have a higher margin. And for you, we need to use the money we're making now to develop the markets where there is appetite for higher value product. Of course, that means Europe. Of course, that means the US, but it really means the coastal provinces of China, where we have not had enough penetration, and we could have a much higher penetration of sales activity and capital raising. We've not seen a lot there. You know, a few years ago, I co-hosted a meeting chaired by the governor of the People's Bank of China in Shanghai with the Inter-American Development Bank on the potential for green bonds and green finance. We had people like the NDSE and Banco do Brasil and so on represented. It was a start that we haven't been able to capitalize on. I feel times have changed now. And I think thanks to the growth of institutions like the New Development Bank, we've got new friends who can help us achieve this. Although, of course, Inter-American Development Bank, well, at least the staff anyway, are keen to try and support this. So I think there's opportunities for us which are amazing here. And it's just our job now to simply get business flowing, get deals flowing. Events like this are really important in terms of bringing parties together. It does depend, though, on maintaining quality. So the critical feature for all of this is to build on the innovation that's happened in Brazil for high quality, sustainable agriculture. And as you know, it's not always the case. We still have an internal fight in Brazil to push standards, to make sure they're adopted, to make sure they're policed. I mean, the forest law, one of those great innovations of regulatory activity in Brazil. We've seen a diminution of policing of the forest law in the last few years. It's to the benefit of Brazil Inc., of Brazil brand, to ensure that we don't have the difficulties that we maintain high quality everywhere. We cannot afford another Marfrig or JBS scandal. We need those companies to be successful in providing high quality food. Of course, and I want to stress this, it's not just looking at the existing base of sustainable agriculture. It's also looking at the new industries. You know, in China, in the 5-year plan, we've just seen the inclusion of alternative protein, synthetic meat, into one of the areas of focus for China. Whoa! On one hand, that's potentially a major risk for Brazilian meat industry if that were to work in China. But Brazil could engage with these agendas now and say, we're going to be part of developing new foods, new areas of production, which are sustainable because we have a really deep understanding of sustainability and partner with Chinese organizations in doing this. There's opportunities galore in doing this, but we need to maintain quality. We need to have an eye on that urgency that Mazzilo talked about, that I mentioned at the beginning, the spectre of climate change. We're going to need to adapt. We know that. It will mean dramatic changes anyway in China and in Brazil in the next, not 30 years, but the next 10 years, to where crops are grown, to how we manage our land use because of climate change. But while we're doing this, if we take the appropriate steps, if we grow the right businesses and the right capital flows, we can make this highly profitable, highly remunerative, and deliver for our consumers in each market what we need to deliver, which is a combination of sustainability, clean and green, and of course, the wealth that comes from creating sustainable industries. Thank you.
好的，谢谢上 KD 尼先生的介绍。下面呢，我们有请下一位发言嘉宾是安娜。
Thank you. With that, we move to the next speaker, Ana Lucia.
Muito obrigada, é um prazer estar aqui. Gostaria de agradecer a todos os demais panelistas.
好，那有请安娜女士。
Muito obrigada pelo convite. É um prazer estar aqui com tantos nomes renovados e que trazem tanto para acrescentar esse diálogo tão fundamental se a gente quiser continuar tendo alimentos num futuro de longo prazo e vida no planeta.
É um problema com a tradução, está entrando o canal em inglês e não em português, porque a Lúcia está falando. Tem um tradutor, o tradutor de inglês...
We have a problem. Seems like the audio from the English translation was getting into the Portuguese channel. TNC is an environmental organization. It's an NGO, and in the last years, we have been working with several initiatives to foster the production of soybean and livestock production, which is the main drivers of deforestation in these biomes. One of the initiatives we have is the harmonization of criteria, in which we have created two guidelines for environmental conduct. One for soybean production in the Cerrado, which is Cerrado Savannah biome, and the other for livestock production in beef production in the Amazon. The rationale behind that, it's quite simple after we see the data. We estimate the demand for land to increase the soybean production in Cerrado is 7 million hectares. And we know that we have 18 million hectares of pasture land, which are ready for soybean production. So it's perfectly possible to meet all of the demand for soybean without further deforestation. So we are talking about a horizontal area expansion. In the case of livestock, Brazilian cattle breeding is below its own potential right now. We know that it is possible based on data and techniques that Embrapa developed 20 years ago. We know that it is possible to sustainably intensify livestock production and increase the productivity with less area. And it's an increase in productivity of times 3 or 5. So what we try to do is a harmonization of all of the existing initiatives and a consultation process. In each one of these guidelines for environmental conduct, we have consulted over 200 experts from many different institutions, and we have a very simple list of activities. I'm trying to share my screen, and I'll show you 2 slides, just a couple of slides. And we have here, can you see my screen? And we have for sustainable soybean production in Cerrado biome, 3 compulsory or mandatory requirements. Legal compliance with in all of the places in which that legal personality is working on, a cutoff date for no deforestation, which is January of 2018. And we also need to keep a close eye in irrigation. In areas in which there's water or hydrological stress, we cannot have irrigations except if we are changing from a less efficient to a more efficient system. The additional requirements and the recommendation is that each institution could use them as they wish to create different products in their portfolio. So the cutoff date should apply, which is the DCF, should apply to all properties. Spatial prioritization, good agricultural practices, land conflict management, as well as, I can't quite see the last point on my slides, but the interpreters can see it, it's Ifc Performance Standards. This is for soybean. There's no certification. This is just a guideline. There may be a second opinion in that. In the case of cattle environmental framework, which is for the Amazon region and the Cerrado biome, it's a bit different. Irrigation is not an issue. So the mandatory requirements are just the legal compliance and the cutoff date for no deforestation. And the additional requirements, some of them are very similar. Cutoff date for zero deforestation in all properties of the funded regions for individuals or companies. Spatial prioritization, we don't want to foster the expansion into new areas. Good agricultural practices.
A smaller carbon emission per kilo of beef produced, and we also make a carbon calculator available that estimates that. It is not for certification. The objective here is to be something straightforward, and the objective is not to generate an additional cost for implementation for the financial institution. We also recommend the management of land conflicts in all properties, and also to adopt as additional benefit the criteria, the IFC performance criteria and good practices for the supply chain. And what does that mean in terms of livestock? Well, this is a recommendation to look to the indirect suppliers, not only the ones who sell to the slaughterhouse, but who's funded. And here we're talking about a conduct guide to fund a beef producing plant. And if they have the criteria of traceability for the beef, and as well as the inputs that will feed this cattle, like the soy, and this will be a great implement, and this may generate advantages to funding. I'd like to show you these guides are public. They're public. They are on our website for each of them. We have an executive summary and the whole guideline. And more recently, also to foster the action of the actions of the financial sector in the fostering to deforestation-free production of such important commodities, we created a coalition called IFAC, in financial innovation for the Amazon, Cerrado, and Chaco. And there we have 3 partners working with that: PNC, PFA, linked to the World Economic Forum, and UNEP, the United Nations Environmental Fund, and what we want is the commitment, understanding that finance is a part of the equation, and we want the commitment of financial institutions that has the possibility of taking resources to producers, where each institution makes a commitment, which is a part of their portfolio. We're not. This doesn't need to be cross-cutting to the whole portfolio to take this funding. Well, currently we have 14 institutions committed with, and now this commitment is above $4 billion, with the commitment of investing $200 million until the end of 2022. Yesterday, as a coincidence, we had the launch of the first product, which was an $11 million product that has many of our signatories, like SIM and OPEA, and has others in development. Yes, I'm about to finish. And here, a call for any institution that will take those resources to the livestock and soy producers that want to join this group will be very welcome. This is a very light financing structure where the objective is to support and facilitate this transition. Thank you very much. Thank you, Anna. So, Danqing, você tem a palavra e eu vou pedir para os palestrantes. I will ask the speakers to control their time. We can't hear you quite well. Okay, it's better now. So let me be closer to the microphone, and I'll share my PowerPoint. So what I will bring is about, well, the transition finance for sustainable agriculture in China. I'll talk about 3 aspects. The first of them is sustainable agricultural development under the China carbon neutrality goal. as well as the criteria for the standard financial and some of the challenges that we have. As you all know, China has presented their targets for carbon neutrality, and the system, China has launched a guideline, and each of the sectors, each of the ministries is responsible for elaborating an action plan for each of the sectors. In the past, agriculture was focused more on the control, the pollution control and management of waste and green food, environmental production. But under this view of target or carbon targets, we're going to work to try and mitigate and adapt to climate change. Agriculture is one of the most affected sectors by the climate change, and we must develop a resilient agriculture to the climate changes. In this institutional framework, 1+N brings different sectors. We discussed in July last year, the Minister of Agriculture was able to launch their action plan. And in this document, well, we're going to work with carbon sequestration as well as the reduction of the greenhouse gases emissions. And besides that, this plan is also related to food security and the rural revitalization and the modernization of agriculture. So those 5 aspects are walking hand in hand in this process. The document of the Ministry of Agriculture has also presented some important tasks. For instance, we have here the methane reduction for the rice production and the reduction of fertilizers and an increase in its efficiency, the reduction of greenhouse gases for livestock, and as well as for fishing. They use a more efficient machinery, besides other aspects as well. And all that corresponds to the growth of the future of sustainable agriculture in China and beyond. And returning to the finance sector, since 2016, China has launched the green finance system, but under this perspective of new targets for carbon emission, will also eliminate even better and widen the scope of these green finance. And I'd like to mention the opinion of Dr. Majin, that under his perspective, we must work in 5 different aspects, or 4 aspects are related to green finance, such as the disclosure of information, and as well as political incentives, and a more fair transition, as well as financial products, as well as their criteria. And we must assess all the impacts for the environment and to take that into consideration with green finance. In agriculture, you see the prices of grains, as well as the profitability of the industries and the producers, especially the mid and small-sized producers. And this criteria for the finance is very important, because first, or to prevent this transition motion, and also to foster the participation of the financial institution in this process. At this moment, there are some criteria in the national level for the green finance, and it has to do with some activities of transition, but not all of them, but most of them. Most of the transition activities are not included. So we're working under these aspects to focus on the targets of reduction of carbon emissions, as well as the climate change. And we are working according to international standards. So we must consider the, the principles of reduction of greenhouse gases, and this must be clearer and more aligned with the Chinese targets of carbon reduction. And besides that, the assessment must be in the project at project level as well as company level. And the third principle, well, this criteria needs to be updated according to the technological progress. And the fourth point is these activities may not do significant harm to other sustainable development goals. And on the fifth principle, we must bring flexibility using other transition paths not included in our official lists. And we must take into consideration new technological advances and technological advances that are not considered right now. And these technologies, well, it needs a credible third-party certification. And the sixth principle is that these criteria must be more understandable and easier to apply. And on a sense of and within the Ministry of Agriculture, a work group has been created to launch a public consultation of different measures, different concrete measures, to elaborate these transition financing criteria. And here we have some examples in green. You see the projects, and the green line has to do with the companies, with agriculture related company. We have the agricultural production. We have forestry, fishing, as well as livestock, and processing of food. We have a description of the pathway and the main criteria that with the numeric limit for the reduction of emissions or a percentage of an average in the industry or the region, and it needs to show a significant improvement in these numbers. But obviously, we do not decide or impose this or that path or a certain way for companies to find this reduction. They must work to improve the instruments, also to reach the result and the commitment taken, and to count on a third-party certification. And with this criteria, we'll consider that they attend to the green finance criteria. We have some solutions for the challenges. For instance, well, we have different challenges and some vague criteria rather, and for the low carbon agriculture. So we must specify, we must detail these criteria, and the agricultural authorities are the ones responsible for that. And it also a partnership between the agricultural authorities and the financial institutes to define these criteria. And besides that, the industrial concentration is low. 98% are micro or small enterprises. So small producers, they don't have the technological capacity or understanding to use this technology. So that makes it, this is a bottleneck for these technologies. To try and sort that out, we must to work with fintechs as well as the supply chain to try and mitigate this challenge. And finally, there's a lack of compensatory mechanisms with positive externalities. And in that sense, we can establish incentive and fiscal mechanisms, and also to start with the carbon market that just July last year was launched by China. And with that, we must put to work a volunteer market, and this allows a better carbon sequestration for the livestock and fishing. We have two cases. Well, first, a financial instrument that is linked to this, a bond linked to sustainability, a loan for sustainability, and these instruments, well, the interest rate is linked to the sustainability targets. And here there's an example, international example. And here we have loans linked to sustainability. The KPIs are divided in two aspects. The first one, the ADSG rating, and the traceability of the products, as well as the social and environmental effects. This company imports soy from Brazil, so we must see where, or to see the origin of these products, and as well as the social environmental effects. And we always require a certification, a third-party certification. COFCO International is a state-owned company, but we are also with the mid-sized companies here. We have a agricultural technology company, and they apply some digital technologies for the reduction of emissions in agriculture. And besides that, they have a smart service system to help the producers in the platform to make more assertive decisions and more environmentally correct decisions.
In addition to that, the platform is also connected to the supply chain finance. Therefore, it is also able to provide information and data from the producers and to financial institutions, and so the finance institutions can provide loans and funding to different producers, and it creates a system of sharing risks, and that presents three benefits. So there are three effects: carbon reduction, as well as economic and financial benefits to farmers. So financial benefits include loans for 62 farmers and lower costs in 70% lower costs for the farmers involved in the program. Thank you very much for your presentation. Your presentation was very assertive in terms of presenting the practices here in China. We will have now some Brazilian speakers on the line. We have first the General Director of Agroicone, Mr. Rodrigo Lima. You have the floor. Thank you very much. It is my pleasure to participate in this dialogue, which is fundamental to our future as a species, as mankind. I'd like to thank you for the invitation of the Business Council Brazil-China on behalf of Ambassador Neves, and I would like to start by using what or elaborating on what was mentioned before by some colleagues. I'd like to mention three crises of the environmental agenda that are designed within the context of the United Nations, which is the climate change crisis. So the climate crisis, the pollution climate. And so we are talking about sustainable production and how to fund sustainable food products with the climate perspective and also reduction of greenhouse effect gases, as well as considering the loss of biodiversity. It's important to remember that we'll have COP15 under China's coordination. The meeting will be in Montreal in December, and it was recently announced that it has a purpose of celebrating the global framework of biodiversity, which will be a very important measure to guide multilateral agendas in terms of biodiversity topics. And there will also be a discussion on pollution. But when I look at the three environmental crises, it's very important to bring to the table the increasing food unsafety, so it's insecurity. So it is very concerning that we have 50 million people starving in the world today. We were progressing relatively well in terms of achieving sustainable development goal number 2, but then we had a pandemic and now the war. Everything got more complicated. And this scenario of food insecurity, it seems to be parallel to the environmental crisis. But I bring this in the context that the United Nations should reach 8 million people in November of this year. Actually, we will have a population of 8 billion people by the end of this period. And facing this scenario where we have the three environmental crises and we have the crisis of food insecurity, which is growing a lot in many parts of the world, then we can see the challenge of feeding 8 billion people sustainably and how to produce food as sustainably and how to fund all of that sustainably. So that's the huge challenge that we have ahead. So how to favor or how to stimulate the transition of food production systems based on resilient agriculture and livestock production. I think it's very relevant to consider in this discussion that there is no single solution to the problem. We shouldn't focus on just one side. The previous presentation has highlighted the challenges on how to foster and the small farmers in China that have no access to technology or innovation to start having access to technology and innovation so that they can improve their productive practices, increase productivity. And this is not a challenge just for China. Here in Brazil, we have an incredible challenge of integrating millions, well, let me say approximately 4 million small farmers in Brazil, and to bring them all together, bring them into sustainable production, food production that would adopt technologies and innovations to take credit and to produce more while reducing impacts, reducing the need for area, minimizing emissions, with this perspective of gain. So thinking about the many possibilities and opportunities to stimulate this transition, and we are here to discuss financing for those measures. So going beyond carbon, well, I must look at the Paris Agreement. So that goes beyond carbon, but I look at the Paris Agreement and I can see that there are 140 nationally determined contributions that consider the scope of agriculture in itself. So if we look at the rationale of the Paris Agreement, in which we asked the Conference of the Parties and the Climate Conference to look inside and see what is the contribution that they need to promote in terms of mitigation and adaptation to climate change, funding, technologies, capacity building. So 140 countries have mentioned agriculture because they're truly concerned with the impact that onto food production, and reinforcing the concern with food insecurity. And these parties are willing to adopt measures that will reduce emissions, but also implement adaptations to climate change. When we observe 140 mentions to agriculture, it's important to remember that we have in the Climate Convention the joint work, and we have some expectation in the COP27 in Egypt to adopt a decision to advance in agricultural discussions. That they have really advanced from 2018 to this day, with this perspective of what is important to do in terms of agriculture for the reduction or for the addressing of climate change. And that was very well illustrated by the previous presentations. So we intend to make a decision to create a permanent group of agriculture within the Climate Convention and the Conference of the Parties to address funding, technology that includes access and transfer of technologies, and capacity building and training as well, because otherwise the 140 parties that want to act in agriculture might not be able to do so when considering this challenge of making this transition to a resilient agriculture, climate smart agriculture that will produce more, reduce emissions, and allow for the adaptation of different productive systems. So I understand that the private funding is perfectly connected to this challenge of how to stimulate, how to foster this transition while adapting to the different needs of the parties of the climate conference, the conference of the parties. So this decision to be taken in Egypt, hopefully, seems to me very relevant so that we can, as countries, as banks, and as a private sector, to drive this wheel into the transition to an agriculture that is needed to, that is ready to address global warming, to improve production and everything else, with financing and funding happening and operating. And in the funding agenda in the convention within this group, we expect that climate funding is also dedicated to these MDCs when we're talking about agriculture, in addition to private funding and the agenda we are discussing today as well. And I must highlight the case of Brazil that was actually mentioned by Secretary Guilherme, and I imagine that other speakers will address it. Well, the low carbon agriculture as a new phase of the Brazilian low carbon agriculture project, which is quite ambitious to reach 52.6 million hectares adopting these technologies, reducing up to 1 billion tons of equivalent CO2. And we have in Brazil a very robust strategy in our MDC when we are talking about agriculture and livestock, over 139. So in this sense, I think it's important to mature this debate, and Horta will probably be an important element for that. And to close in the decision in Egypt, I would like to close. I'd like to briefly mention the carbon market, because there's a lot of anxiety around or surrounding the carbon market, and everybody wants to generate carbon market. But generating carbon market, as it means to generate a product for someone to buy. But within the carbon market, which is regulated according to Article 6 on the Paris Agreement, items 6 to 4, China deserves a distinction here based on the focus they adopted in the creation of their own carbon market. Brazil is only just beginning to take its first steps towards that. But we have, with the World Bank, 68 different pricing mechanisms for carbon markets. So these are legal mechanisms, institutional mechanisms, and so on. And it's important to highlight that the agriculture that reduces emissions, that can capture this reduction of emissions, and there's material that the TNC developed for that. And the government is also working. For example, the BNDES in Brazil is working to build a livestock calculator. If I can, for cattle, so if I can prove that there has been an effective reduction or sequestration of emissions in in some place, I can effectively generate carbon credits. So it's a way of stimulating sustainable production. And agriculture is not the largest source of emissions. You have energy market with most of the emissions, but you can have agriculture participating in the carbon market as a voluntary market, because companies adopt targets of neutrality and they have to reduce emissions. So we eventually get or come to agricultural production. So I like to think in all of these pieces as necessary elements of the puzzle, so that we can, in the world, think multilaterally, so that we can drive the agricultural production of food in a sustainable manner. And we have many interesting cases, and we must consider the transition. And in my understanding, for that, we have to work with a wider mechanism, and this event today, in my opinion, contributes towards that end. Thank you. We now give the floor to Joint Secretary from the Ministry of Environment, Ângelo Mazzilo. Secretary, you have the floor. Greetings from Brazil. Good morning in Brazil. Good evening in China. Thank you, by UN. I would like to thank the Business Council Brazil-China for the opportunity. My activity here in the Ministry of Agriculture in Brazil has been for the search of the mindset, the change of the mindset of the agribusiness sector in Brazil in terms of funding. we want to expand this mindset, and we are managing to do so, so that farmers, private investors, business people get connected together and open up pathways. So we have private funding for the agricultural sector, for agribusiness in Brazil, with sustainability as a focus. So sustainability considers the 4 pillars. So for an activity to be sustainable, it has to be sustainable economically and financially, environmentally, that's the 2nd pillar, socially, that's the 3rd pillar, and fundamentally, it should be sustainable in terms of governance. And for us to have this sustainable mindset, we need to redesign financial markets and improve its architecture, their architecture, so that they can handle the flow of financial resources we aim to establish, and we need the proper financial mechanisms. A few years ago, we had a lot of gaps to sort out, and I would say that we have worked with all of the gaps. That doesn't mean that there's no room for improvement. Improvement is always continuous. This never ends. So the design of the markets, the migration of the mindsets from conventional to sustainable activities, that always requires improvement. But the main gaps are already sorted out. But what we need to do right now is to drive the discussion so that it would gain traction. This discussion is very repetitive in many aspects, and we needed to move forward. So we here are adopting the policy of pragmatism. So we are trying to be very practical. So if we understand that we have sorted out the gaps in the financial market and in the field, what we need to take the quality leap is to increase the flow of inputs and of investment, so that we can consolidate everything and expand the practices to meet the global demand with the sustainability, which is what we managed to do. We are perfectly able to do that, but we need these discussions to gain more traction so that we can make things happen effectively. So I have some slides here to show you. Just a second, let me set this up here. My cursor in the mouse has just disappeared. Let me find it. Sorry about that. I prepared everything, but don't seem to find my presentation. Just a second, please.
José Ângelo, Camila, você tem a apresentação do
Não, tá
José?
certo aqui. Me perdoe, é problema de...
No, I found it. Thank you.
Então vamos lá. Hoje nós vamos conversar. Eu estou aqui no primeiro painel.
So this is panel number 1.
E vou participar hoje e amanhã. Hoje,
and I'll be participating today and tomorrow. Today, we'll show you what we're doing in the ministry and the results we've accomplished. So the new agri law has expanded some financial mechanisms, and I'll end with some remarks. I'll show you that things are happening in Brazil. The purpose here is to show investors that they can come, our market is ready, and things are going on. And we need to know from investors what they need from us, because anything you need, we will meet your demand. We'll do our homework, and we need you, investor, that has decided to invest in sustainable agribusiness, that you have targets for that, and you wish to invest in sustainable agriculture. Tell us what you want from Brazil, and we'll meet your demand.
So focusing on what I will say today, I'll talk about today, what were the main results we have reached in the past years? Well, we had the agro law, the ones that was published in April 2020. We published a second one, improving the private financial markets with a sustainable footprint and the focus of sustainability of the agribusiness. We just had the second one published recently on July 20th this year. And we are developing financial innovation because one of the gaps is the distance between the investors and the field. but the financial institutions have pulverized this gap. Today, we can see what happens within the property. And Brazil is a country that promotes transparency. If you want to come to Brazil, you have free traffic to get to know whatever you want. So come here, get to know what's happening in Brazil. You have Google Earth today. You can select points in the Brazilian territory, and you can have an idea if there's a forest or not, if it's a city there, implementation or not, and then you have an idea on how our countries. But come here, the Ministry of Agriculture will prepare a trip for you, investor, that wants to do the sustainable agro. And we have a wide group of fintechs and startups that simply put the investor within the property with full governance. Without transparency, we have no governance. We have a lot of transparency and a lot of governance. Without governance, there's no sustainability. And we can offer all that. And for us to be able to fill other gaps, we created a partnership with CBI, a climate bond initiative. The taxonomy was not consolidated, and now we are working in a very close way and in a very fruitful way. And I say that we were able to sort out the main gaps. That does not mean that we don't need to improve the process. The improvement of the process is constant, it is permanent, and will never stop. Now, results achieved, financial market, April 2020, when the agro law came, with the stock of bonds that the rural producers issue to get funding was 3.6, more or less, billion dollars. In June 2022, this amount reached $29.4 billion, a variation of over 700% during these months. We have a cover bond, LCA. There was a great there was a great increase. CDCA, it is a bond from receivables. It left from 4.2 billion to $7 billion, and have CRA, another one, ABS, asset-backed security, that there was almost 9 and now is reaching 16 billion in the times between both laws. We institute FIAGRO, an agribusiness investment fund. During the 6 months, we issue over $1 billion in quota of these funds. This is not too little. This is a brand new fund, but that shows the appetite for the investors on one hand, and the appetite for the producers to receive this funding and respond with their business. I have an order of grandeur from 2019 to 2022. The green bonds, the sustainable bonds issued by our agro sector, they are almost $10 billion. So in the issue of CPR, because the data in this picture is stocks, but the issue of CPR is around $33 billion a year. So every year we issue 80,000 CPRs, which are equivalent to $33 billion. Those bonds here, they are from financial markets. They're not green ones. No, they encompass the sustainable ones as well as the conventional finance ones. And this just to show the size of the Brazilian market. And now our market, of course, the screen here is a bit too polluted, but I left it in Portuguese. I apologize for that. But those are all the products, all activities that are being financed, by these funds, by these bonds. I mean, we have all agricultural productions, agro industries, and we have our market working with a wide array of products. And we have this new agro law, the second framework that we're working with. And I must say that we got this bond that the producers may issue CPR, and we expanded it. We expand the use of CPR. CPR may be used for all that you can see here to fund agriculture, livestock, forestry activities, extractivism, and fishery, fish farming. And I'll leave item two to the end. We'll have the three industrialization of activities of the of item one in the case of for the production and commercialization of agricultural inputs, machinery, and implements for agriculture. And all of that CPR will be the vehicle for the traffic of investment. But item two is the one that will have expanded its use, the use of environmental sustainability of CPR. So now the law clearly states that CPR may be used for conservation, recovery, and sustainable management of native forests and their biomes. CPR can be used for the recovery of degraded area or restoration of degraded area and pastures. We can use the pasture or grazing areas for the conversion towards soy, and CPR may fund that. CPR will may also fund any service provision within the rural property, the payment of ecosystem services. All that is in the law, and we have the financial ways paved for us to increase the attraction of private investment to sustainable agricultural production. And just closing my presentation, I must say, we have in Brazil huge opportunities. So huge opportunities only for the capital flow within the farms. We need $160 billion just for working capital, just for investment, and the other, as well as the other links in the agribusiness. We have high yield operations with solid guarantees and sustainability. And I put data on my experiences. The investor can get in dollar around 10% a year. And we have the financial capital market, very solid, very reliable and efficient. And we have financial innovation to guarantee good governance. So right now, what is missing for the potential investors? We want to establish a frank, open dialogue for us to be able to fill out these bottlenecks that prevent the entrance of your capital to a sustainable agribusiness. And I'm certain that we will reach good terms. I'll finish my presentation. I'll talk to you again tomorrow. Thank you.
好，谢谢侯队先生的介绍。正好有一个问题哈，我们留言板里边有大概
Thank you for the presentation. I see on chat. I see questions. I see some 6 or 7 questions. So I'll choose some of them due to time constraints. ABC 2020 through 23, ABC Plus.
就是再生农业系统的具体计划，希望您能用1分钟能够回答哈。
Is there this support for funding? Because we have this useful one, and if you have other questions, please send that through chat. And so for the first question, who's going to answer it?
Eu vou falar alguma coisa. Se refere ao programa.
It talks about the ABC Plus. We'll have the ABC Plus and ABC Plus, the ABC and ABC Plus program. This is a government-backed or supported program that are used to support the sustainable practices of our agriculture and livestock. They are very important. They're happening, but our challenge is to increase that. Our practices are not funded only with the ABC Plus. No, they're funded also by the Safra plan out of the ABC, as well as the 100% private finance that I'll talk about tomorrow. Our challenge is to organize the agricultural financial data in a wholesome form that contemplates everything that is sustainable practice, and that's something that we're still working on as a challenge for the market. And we're working with CPI for private credit internally with the government with this credit, which is the object of the SAFRA plan that has government support. And certainly, what the finance supports in agro today is way beyond the numbers of ABC Plus. For the we want for the ABC plan to gain more traction and to be more encompassing. Thank you.
谢谢。可能刚才这个翻译这边可能有一些不是很清楚哈，他讲的中文叫再生农业，也请这个翻译可能到时候再翻译一下。但是因为时间有限哈，我们想待会儿侯醉先生您把这个答案可以具体回到这个聊天栏里，是再生农业 ABC Plus 的2022到2023年的计划当中，是否可以考虑支持再生农业？那好，那由于时间有限，为了更准时的推进
ABC Plus. Let's continue ahead.
债券相关的一些产品的一些分享啊。那下面的环节呢，我邀请巴西中国
Thank you for the consideration. I'd like now to
来进行主持。好 ，Claudia，把这个话筒交给你。
We're almost out of time. I just see. I need to pass the floor to Claudia now. And the speakers of the first session may turn off their audio and their cameras. Thank you very much. Thank you. We had several questions in this first panel, and we'll send these questions for the speakers, for the panelists, and I hope they can answer these questions. Well, good morning to all of you. I'm Paula Treville, Executive Director of the Brazil-China Council, Business Council, and the panel that I will moderate is reports of the front line, challenges in the perspective of the financial institutions. And we have the privilege of having with us executives that will bring different points of view to this debate, with the presence of a great multilateral organization, great Brazilian bank, Chinese banks, and international scope, banks of international scope. And now I'd like to call to our virtual stage, Mauricio Xavier, the lead for the Americas office of a new development bank, Jaime Pinto Jr., Foreign Trade Director and Corporate Bank of Bank of Brazil, the Brazilian financial institution that is leader in the concession of agricultural credits with over half of the portfolio, half of the existing operation, YBL Cheng, head of the Chinese Agricultural Bank in São Paulo, Thiago Ashan, Vice President of the Bank of China in Brazil. And I'd like to highlight both the Chinese Agricultural Bank as well as the Bank of China. They are among the biggest banks of China. Luiz Guimarães, Director of Credit and Legal and Compliance Control of the BBM. It's a Brazilian bank controlled by another large Chinese bank, Bank of Communications, and Tassiano Custódio, Head of Sustainability of the Rabobank Brazil, international bank that has a strong action in agribusiness. Welcome. Thank you very much for being here in this event. Each one of you will have 7 to 8 minutes for your presentation. And I kindly ask everybody to respect the time for us to have space for a debate at the end of the panel. Mauricio, you have the floor. Hello, good morning. Good evening for the ones in China. I'll share my brief presentations in 4 parts. Well, the first of them where I'll introduce the bank, since it is a new bank, not all of you know the actions of NDB, and then I'll talk about how the bank supports the infrastructure for sustainable agribusiness, followed by the indication of the products or a list of products that the bank has in Brazil, and a conclusion on what we want to do on the days ahead. What is it? What is NDB? As Claudia mentioned, it's a multilateral development bank created by BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. It is a new bank that started in 2015 and is open for new countries to associate to it. In 2021, 4 countries joined the bank. So we have the United Arab Emirates, Bangladesh, Egypt, and Uruguay. They are in the process of participation in the capital of NDB. Well, our mission is to mobilize resources, storage infrastructure, and sustainable development projects. The BRICS, for the BRICS and other emerging economies. Just for you to understand the size of the bank, currently we have around 77 projects approved in a total portfolio of $30 billion globally. In Brazil, what we do in Brazil, well, we have a regional office of the Americas where we cover with more countries in America as they participate in the bank, and we have offices in Brasilia and São Paulo, and the focus is the public sector. In São Paulo, we have the private sector. So our main mission in Brazil is to originate the business opportunities for the NDB to fund or invest. And now in Brazil, our portfolio represents $5 billion of approved projects, and they are more equivalent to 17% of the total portfolio of the bank. So it is a new bank that already has a large volume of projects, which is quite meaningful. And how does our support to sustainable agriculture works? Well, NDB, different from other multilateral banks and the other ones that we have in this panel, such as Bank of Brazil, NDB supports or has its focus exclusively in infrastructure. So for the support to agribusiness, this will be done in an indirect fashion. For instance, funding warehousing or storage, transportation, as well as generation of energy that may be used in the agribusiness. And that way, the bank has been working in Brazil. So I can mention a couple of examples. In the sustainable agricultural production, although NDB does not supply working capital, they may supply the funding for the renewable energy projects that will make this agricultural production more sustainable. And on the side of transportation and storage, NDB has established funding lines to support the construction of silos and stocks where you assess the reduction of emissions or reduction of the energy consumption.
Associated to this warehousing infrastructure and other warehousing parameters that exist in the market. So you compare the reduction of the energy consumption in a structure funded by a bank, and you compare that to a structure, to a traditional structure. Something very important is transportation and the outflow of the production. The bank can fund roadways and ports because it's no use having an agricultural production which is efficient. To increase the productivity of land, But when you need to transport, you have lines on ports, or you have traffic jam on the roads, and spend time and reducing the benefit that was generated by that improvement in productivity. So our role is to act complementary to other banks that are specialists. So we provide indirect support through infrastructure funding. So how do we how do we offer this support? And how do we connect these projects, these products to sustainability? So the bank can directly finance private clients with volumes of credit to between 50 and $250 million to businesses or government entities. And indirectly, we have established several partnerships with Brazilian banks, such as the Bank of Brazil, BNDES, the regional Southern Bank in Brazil, and we finance these banks, and these banks, for being more knowledgeable than us in the agricultural sector, can use our funds to support their customers' infrastructure. So this is the role of the multilateral financial institution, not competing or acting in the same way as other banks, but providing financial solutions. Sometimes the long-term solutions or different from the existing solutions of the market. The bank acts through its regional offices, and if you're interested in knowing more about our lines of activity and our products, you can get in touch with us directly. And one example of this partnership I can comment on, Jairo is here in the panel, Jaime is here in the panel today as well. But Bank of Brazil and DB are working in a sustainable line of funding for agribusiness. So it really shows how this partnership happens. A specialist entity can work with a multilateral bank, which is focused on infrastructure, so as to benefit the whole industry, which is so important for exports and for the balance sheets of the country at large. So thank you very much, Claudia, for the opportunity, and I'm open to questions. Jaime, thank you, Mauricio. Jaime, you have the floor. Welcome. Thank you, Claudia. I'd like to thank the invitation from the CBBC to participate in such a relevant agenda for our country and for our customers as well. So Banco do Brasil, so the Bank of Brazil is the major agribusiness partner in Brazil. From the crops of 2021 and 22, we applied 53 billion reais, which is a 34% increase when compared to 2020 and 2021. We completed thousands of operations, and 55% of these operations were completed through the national program of strengthening of family farming, which is called PRONAF in Brazil. So for this crop, for this season 2022-2023, Banco do Brazil will earmark 200 billion reais, which is 43% of the previous period. So it's the largest volume made available for Brazilian agribusiness in history. So these figures really show the protagonism of Banco do Brasil for the strengthening of agribusiness, and we have a specialized technical body. We are present in all places of the country and present abroad as well. And this broad activity allows us to get to know the activities of the rural areas, sharing challenges and opportunities for the evolution of this segment. The bank also recognizes that the productive activity, either urban or rural, in the same time as it produces positive economic benefits, it can generate On the other hand, negative impacts over ecosystems and quality of life of people. This is why the bank is engaged in an effort of society on behalf of sustainability through initiatives like the Agenda 30 and the 10 commitments with sustainability that the bank has signed in March of 2021. About this last one, among its commitments that we have the commitment of having a sustainable business or sustainable agribusiness portfolio of 125 billion reais up to 2025. And in December of 2021, our portfolio was 121.5 billion reais.
Aconteceu alguma coisa com seu som. A gente perdeu você.
So the positioning of sustainable productive chains reinforces the alignment of the bank with the UNDP, the national, or actually the United Nations Program for the Environment on green economy and best practices, business practices, and that has a positive impact in the relationship with the customers, employees, and investors, improving the reliability for the capturing or the attraction of resources, both externally and internally. And the largest demands for solutions and sustainable business models come from the customers themselves. They are more and more looking to consume products and services that are sustainable and to establish relationships with social and environmentally responsible companies. Agribusiness is one of the sectors presented by Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, the TCFD, as one of the most exposed sectors to climate change. In Brazil, 50% of our agro portfolio is sustainable, and we have the challenge of replicating the good practices that we helped financing, such as some people have already commented, also low carbon agriculture, funding through direct plantation, renewable energies, recovery of pasture lands, integration between crops, cattle, and forests, among others. We believe that the rural credit can be a tool to leverage sustainable agriculture, thus accelerating the transition through a green economy with more productivity and income, more food security, resilience to climate change, reduction of the carbon emissions, and other benefits. So I'd like to list a few points in which Banco do Brasil, Bank of Brazil, can contribute with. So considering its capacity of coordinating projects and partnerships like this one with the INDB. So to reinforce the capacity building of the teams in the agencies, to put available credit lines aimed at sustainable certifications with better conditions, to reinforce the availability of credits for investments so that we can finance this transition, and to incorporate good businesses practices into good businesses practices, social, environmental, and climate criteria in our risk assessments. And lastly, Banco do Brasil made a commitment to reach zero net emissions in the value chain up to 2050. This is in line with the management of the social, environmental, and climate risks for financial institutions in Brazil. We are also working in measuring the greenhouse effect gases in our credit portfolio through our specialized centers with expertise in international standards. Lastly, Banco do Brasil would like to thank you and congratulate CBBC for organizing this event. We are at your disposal to support Brazilian agriculture, foreign trade, and the development of the country at large. Thank you. Thank you, Jaime. I'd like to give the floor to Huaixiao Chiang, sorry if we are mispronouncing it, from the Bank of Agriculture from China. Thank you for the invitation. We're waiting. Just a second, we're missing the translation to Portuguese. Can the Chinese interpreters please begin? Thank you. I will talk about the challenges and solutions that we've found. We are focused on agriculture. We are experts in agriculture, and we work with product development. So we have different parts. We have the political part, financial, and also capacity building. We train talent so that we can work on innovative products. In 2020, actually 2021, we had 30 billion or 300 billion invested, with an annual growth of 17% for rural credits. And in this process, we have many challenges, and we need to find solutions for that. First, challenges on security, on safety. And we have several contradictions in terms of this insecurity. We have lack of standardization, low outflows, so it doesn't really meet the guidelines adopted by the banks for the proper development of these products. And even then, we managed to cross this barrier and increase loans to these sectors. There's also a capillarity. There's a difference in terms of the different realities in China, in urban and rural areas. So the interest rates are not compatible and not accepted by farmers at a given moment. And that could bring, we should have interest rates that could bring benefits to farmers. So the bank has made a partnership with other institutions, such as ministries, secretariats, in order to promote this first modernization effort so that farmers would have access to credit, technology, and so on. So we needed to work with local governments from the rural areas. So it was a joint work with many different parties so that this funding actually came to fruition. This is how it has been made possible. So now the financial system can reach those farmers, because we also have shortage of personnel and staff to go to all of the rural areas in China and get in touch with them and reach out. So we need the presence of one person specifically, and so as experts. And we also work with companies and businesses so that they can become a part of this network as well. For example, for tea farmers, tea plant farmers, because we had to talk to them, and they know the local reality, and so we know currently how to work with them. Translation apologizes, we're missing the translation into Portuguese from Chinese. The translation from Chinese is no longer coming through.
Posso começar? Sim, sim. Pode continuar. 第二个是信息建档，以村为单位，为农户建立信息档案，提升信息收集能力，再引入多维。
So we have the creation of a database for the farmers, the collection of the information, and so there was a need to create a platform to organize all of that effort. So these are some of the challenges that we face, and it's what I have to share for my work at this moment. Thank you, Huai Biao. It's a pleasure to have you with us here in this event. I'd like to give the floor now to Xia Huaxiang from Bank of China. Thank you, Claudia. Good morning, everyone. So I'm sorry, good morning for those in Brazil and good evening for those in China. And thank you for the invitation from the CBBC to participate on this wonderful event to talk about sustainable agriculture. I will make a very brief presentation about the commitment of the People's Bank of China to the commitment to funding of sustainable agriculture, and we'll talk about green bonds as well. The Bank of China has an activity throughout the years. Bank has dedicated a lot of effort in economic development and sustainable social development as well, by means of financial mechanisms, not only in China. In the first panel, a speaker talked about different initiatives of China, international initiatives of China. So China has been very active internationally as well. So I'd like to share with you all very briefly some initiatives of the bank. So today we won't have time to address all of the initiatives. So I'll just share with you the latest news on the initiatives of the Bank of China. I will share some slides to show you how the Bank of China does it, works with that globally. So Bank of China. Okay, so basically we have 6 pillars to help in this financing promotion of sustainable agriculture, and one of the first pillars is the reliability of the bank in global terms. Today, the bank has total assets of $4.2 trillion. It's certainly among the largest Chinese banks and the largest banks on earth. So in China, they have one of the best ratings. Actually, globally speaking, is one of the best ratings as well. It's a fundamental point because without credibility, it would be very difficult to raise capital to work on this type of financing, especially sustainable funding, which counts on a lot of innovation. Another important point is that a bank needs to have a capillarity for global distribution purposes. This is a point other colleagues have addressed, and it's important to have this global discussion. Today, the bank has over 62 global points of distribution for bonds related to sustainable bonds or green bonds, and also funding. This is a very important point to promote the sustainable financing.
That clear was thought in the point of view of what is the practice, what is the way the bank works. And the third point is the bank participates not only on the larger projects, international projects of the green funding and sustainable funding towards ESG, and that in terms of banking loans, but also bilateral loans and the syndicated loans with other banks. So to be able to do so, this is another point that I would write here. The fourth point, that the Bank of China, it's not only a bank. They have their brokers and distributors. So there's an investment bank on this point. So the bank also subscribes to or underwrites the issue of bonds. Not only, I mean, in Asia, we are the strongest currently, but we are cooperating little by little with the other global banks, working strongly in Europe, in America, and South America, specifically here in Brazil. And the bank, the fifth pillar, the bank issues locally and internationally to be able to do this funding of projects towards sustainability, being agricultural or not. One of the last issues of the bank was $500 million. If I'm not mistaken, was in the Frankfurt subsidiary that has a selection of asset portfolio and sustainable projects for renewable agricultural energy that has is certified according to international standards, that was able to get the capital and support and promote these projects as well. And finally, the last point that is very important that our colleagues, other panelists have mentioned, and my colleague, the head of agricultural bank, just mentioned, the certification, the standardization. I mean, is important to see how you guarantee the funding of the bank, and this helps the companies to reach their target, the sustainable targets, while that will reduce the impact in climate change that reaches ESG and the carbon reduction that many colleagues have mentioned. But what is the criteria? Well, there's more than one criteria. How can the bank act for this type of standardization that will adopt in the concessions with the Bank of China? That's why the bank also participates actively in the discussions and determinations of international certifications, in the establishment of standards. Now, China is very much advanced together with China, with the market, with the European Union, the definition of international standards. I believe this is very important to highlight, because so the bank not only funds aiming the sustainable development, but also participates in the very definition and establishment of targets for everybody to be able to meet the targets and reach this point. And together with this bank initiatives, well, we saw the global recognitions the bank has gained the outstanding leadership in ISG loans and other 4 awards by the Global Finance. And if we see the main loan platforms, the Bloomberg platforms and others, they're always ranked first among the Chinese banks. So for the global offshore range. And here in Brazil, quickly, you may say, well, we brought Petrobras. Yes, just for you to have an idea of the size of the bank. Petrobras issued the last bonds of $1.5 billion in an effort of Petrobras to commit to sustainability and the reduction of carbon emissions. So an initiative there is very much praisable in the bank that is working. The bank is working with other international banks. And we also mentioned the fund of micro and small enterprises. And also I'd like to acknowledge Mr. Jaime from Banco do Brasil has done a great job, but we have different initiatives together with the Bank of Brazil through syndications, because this is syndications of loans, because our action in Brazil and the Bank of China still has a small subsidiary, some 70 employees, so we cannot meet everybody. But what we have done is to try and join and to cooperate with local banks and international banks that work in Brazil to support and promote initiatives towards the sustainable funding in agriculture. Not only agriculture. It's important to mention the agro industry, because that's where you add value to the agriculture of Brazil. And I believe this is the point that the bank has also done a lot of syndication, not only with the Bank of Brazil or Itaú Bank, the Rabo Bank in Santander, as well as other local banks, local international banks that work in Brazil. So that was my brief presentation, and I hope I helped you, and thank you very much. Thank you, Shao. Thank you. I just wanted to invite Luiz Augusto of the IBDM Bank. Good morning to all. First and foremost, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to participate in this meeting that is of global importance and is very much aligned with the business guidelines of our bank. So I'll briefly talk about the participation of the BOCOM BBM in the agro sector, and then I'll talk about a practical example of our social environmental analysis in the credit. Those are pieces of information that are important to share here. We have a long history in the agribusiness with an important growth in the last 5 years. So getting the last 5 years, our credit portfolio has tripled and reached 12 billion reais, and out of that, 42% directed to the agribusiness. And breaking down that 22% of the grain sector and 15% for sugar and alcohol and 15% for the other agribusiness sector. An important target that highlights our participation in the sector is our participation in the coordination of offers in capital markets. In the last 3 years, we worked with around 5.7 billion reais, so around $1 billion, and 1 billion reais with a green bond, and 500 billion or a little close to $100 million. So our gathering of was LCA, which is the latter credit for the agribusiness. And in talking about the relevancy of a social environmental analysis in the credit approvals of the bank, it is important to give a couple of examples. This social environmental analysis is a precondition for clearing of operations, and it is important to bring some practical cases. The bank has a partnership with a renowned company specialized in remote sensing in the operations that we can guarantee rural real estate. And through the satellite analysis, we're able to verify different points. And it's important to highlight the history of reduction in the area throughout the last 10 years. So we can see the use of soil and the absence of illegal deforestation, the certification that the forestry code is being respected, because we can see the preservation of the legal reservation and the permanent preservation area, and the certification that these areas are not placed in environmental conservation units without the due licensing for agricultural production. We have a second partnership with a different specialized enterprise. They do the on-site inspection with the operations that the bank, the safra or the crop or the harvest actually funded, and they go there and see on site the good practices of our clients. So this is an information that we take into consideration internally, and it has to do with sustainability. And a third piece of information that is important to be shared is that Brazil has a very robust base of information certificates, a public base, database of certifications that allows to complement this due diligence. And we have the records of the Rural Environmental Registry, and we can see these areas, and there is the absence of environmental embargoes declared by the Environmental Agency of Brazil. So this is very important in our process, and there is a search for lawsuits against clients with regards to environmental issues, if there is damage to the environment, and it is important to have this database. And the last one is to verify the ownership of that land to try and not enter into operation with poached areas. And we have a recent legislation that was issued by the central bank with regards to the sustainability topic. So we have the 4945 and 4943, upon which the banks are obliged to add to the risk reports not only the opportunities and social environmental risks that count on the legislation, but also to analyze the portfolio with risks and climate opportunities. So there's the climate transition with the low carbon, and there's physical climate risk. So there's an extreme event that may have impacts on portfolios, and this must be measured by the banks. It is a challenge to obtain this database internally. We are in this phase of attempt to obtain that through micro regions, and the probability of an extreme climate event for us to add that to our models and those metrics. But we believe this new regulation is a fundamental step to consolidate the contribution of the financial system with the sustainability of the country. That's what I wanted to bring. Thank you very much for the opportunity of being here. Thank you, Luiz Augusto. Now I pass the floor to our last speaker, the Cassiano Custódio from Rabobank, Brazil.
Tassiano, você está? Acho que Tassiano, você me escuta?
Tassiano, can you hear me?
Ele está online, mas acho que não está ouvindo. Eu vou fazer então uma primeira.
So I'll ask a first question, which was brought in the previous panel, but I believe that is still in the back of the minds of everybody in Brazil, and I'd like to address it to Xia Pashan. Xia, what is the degree of concern in China with sustainability in the agribusiness chain? And if you see the potential of this becoming a criteria in the import decisions from China, similarly to standards that are being adopted in the European Union of binding the import of certain products to zero deforestation, for instance. Well, Tassiano is online, and yeah. Can you answer first, Shai, and then I pass the floor to Tassiano, okay? Sure. Well, thank you, Claudia, for the question. Certainly, Mr. Cheng has a better answer than me, but I'll try to do that in the point of view of the Bank of China. So, one of the priorities of the Bank of China is this food security area, and the bank is very committed into funding the companies, also committed that are committed to the food security, not only in China, but globally as well. This is important to highlight. So if we look into that, the bank is very transparent on its global funding on the website of the bank. Some of them are, most of them in Chinese, but there's a part that is in English that you can query about the initiatives. So if you look at this portfolio, you realize that the bank funds the whole productive chain, and also not only agriculture, but agro-industry. This is important to mention. So it is a priority. Not only the bank has done that throughout the past years, but the bank also allocates billions that will be for the funding of this productive chain. This is the first point. The second, and just if China may adopt the environmental criteria for the import of commodities of soy and meat that is linked to deforestation zero target. Well, with regard to that point, I do not have the latest information, but I believe Mr. Cheng from the Agricultural Bank of China, he would have more information on that regard, on the environmental standards specifically for this agricultural area. I know Mr. Cheng. Cheng, would you have any comments on that? If China is looking into the possibility, or if there's a discussion in China to establish environmental criteria for the import of agricultural commodities, and what is the degree of concern on that sort? Thank you. As a financial institution, the core of our work is the criteria adopted to clear the loans, and that can be linked to some certifications. Yes, if certain companies cannot reach the certification, we may deny this credit line or deny service. Yes, thank you.
Bom, Tassiano.
Thank you, Tassiano. I believe you're back. You have the floor. Welcome. Thank you, Claudia. Thank you. I'd like to thank the Brazil-China Business Council, and I'd like to thank all the authorities and colleagues in this panel. I won't share a presentation. I believe it's more of a quick talk and I will talk about Rabobank. This is a Dutch bank with the rural credit partnership. And what leads our culture all around the globe is that, well, we're over 40,000 employees in 36 countries who work in the whole productive chain from farm to table. And in Brazil, Rabobank is represented in 17 branches in the main agricultural production areas in Brazil. It's more than $10 billion in assets invested, supporting the Brazilian agribusiness. Within Brazil, just for you to understand this impact, our clients of the rural banking, those are the two larger divisions, one corporate and one towards rural producers.
Our customers and rural banking, the rural producers or farmers, they represent 25% of the soybean planted area in Brazil, 35% of sugarcane, and 80% of cotton production. So we are indeed connected to the Brazilian agribusiness in a very, very intimate manner. In 2021, Rabobank has tripled its sustainability agribusiness operation. So it was a very relevant figure, $5 billion invested in 2021 through the issuance of bonds and loans, syndicated loans, and many of which were earmarked for reaching sustainability or social or governance targets. And one thing that I'd like to mention is a generation of technical knowledge about agribusiness. With our food and agro research team, we have a very collaborative activity and efforts in generating in technical scientific knowledge and to provide that to rural producers or actually farmers. And this is a reflex of our culture and our experience with cooperative rural credit and the confidence the customers have in us. So we are able to connect the whole agro business. Rabobank is also signatory of an initiative called Net Zero Banking Alliance with 102 other banks from 40 countries with a total of $43 trillion of assets, carving a pathway towards a low carbon economy. The most important thing here is to say that Rabobank has several financial sustainable solutions, such as operations related to the sustainability linked loans, the SDGs, the linked bonds, blended finance solutions, with a very long period for the operations that the agribusiness require. We have 5, 10, 20 years. So we also have another solution for the carbon market. I think that this is the most important message. Rabobank is a bank that is in Brazil for decades, maintaining sustainability practices for a more efficient territorial occupation, always connected to a very healthy, financially healthy operation of the agribusiness, thus allowing for a local development and supporting the social development of the regions as well, always connected to sustainability and low emission practices. Thank you. Thank you, Tassiano. Congratulations to everyone for having respected the time allocated. This will give us some room for questions. And I'd like to start with Luiz Augusto. In your presentation, you touched upon a very important topic, which is monitoring. The challenge of monitoring for the financial institutions to make sure that the funding is being used properly. I would like to know what are the specific challenges in terms of monitoring and what type of change do you anticipate with the arrival of 5G and the expansion of connectivity in the field? Will it be easier to finance a low carbon agriculture? Yes, absolutely, because of data transmission. So Rodrigo from Icora brought a very important piece of information in the first panel. Brazil needs to integrate 4 million farmers to good technological farming practices. So agricultural practices, not only for monitoring, but for the productivity in the field and to improve the practices so that we can have low emission practices. The improvement in connectivity will be very important. With regards to monitoring, it will certainly help in two aspects, which are scalability. That is, you'll be more connected and you have more data to process and conduct this monitoring remotely. And also very important in terms of emissions is the observancy level. So you need less people going to the field to make the certification, as it was mentioned in previous lectures. So if we can use technology for that, it will help a lot. So scalability and reduction of observation costs. Thank you. One matter that Rodrigo also talked about in his presentation was the possibility of having low carbon agricultural projects and generating carbon credits. So that could be negotiated in the future carbon market. So, Tassiano, how do you see this possibility? What are the difficulties and what are the promises and the expectations so that the low carbon agriculture could generate carbon credits that could be in turn negotiated internationally and marketed internationally. Yes, Rodrigo actually clarified really well the potential Brazil has to generate carbon credits. One important piece of information is that 100% of soybean production in Brazil is already low carbon. So 100% of soybean production is conducted under direct plantation or with overcropping. So we have an already highly sustainable production. So something that goes beyond the farmers, which is, well, a more complex aspect, which is a regulation and organization of a voluntary market that is able to give support back to the farmers. And that does not replace, in my perspective, the value of food production, but rather provides them additional support for protecting native vegetation, for adopting good sustainable practices on the part of the farmers. But the major challenge, in my perspective, Claudia, goes far beyond the carbon market. And it actually converges with the comment from our colleague Rodrigo about the size of the country. We are a continental-sized country with a huge diversity of landscapes, and the social development challenge is huge when we look at the over 6 billion rural properties enlisted in the Brazilian rural register. The average is 1 to 2 minimum wages, so it's a very poor outlook. So and a lot of these properties are small farmers. So in addition to carbon market, which is a huge opportunity, we also have some challenges. For example, to support the growth of agribusiness in a financially healthy way, so that the farmers would have financial independence that would allow them to use more technologies, and that growth would allow for the local development of communities and territories, and so that this growth can also support low carbon production practices with more efficiency in the occupation of the territory, which is to get more assets from the same area towards perpetuating agribusiness as a profitable financial activity, so that the new generations, the future generations would be willing to remain farmers, to work with farming. So these are some important steps for the carbon market. Mauricio, you said that the support of the new development bank to sustainable agriculture happens in a very direct manner, with financing, infrastructure, warehousing. In the opinion of the bank, what are the main weaknesses of Brazil in the area of infrastructure, and what are the bank's priorities in the funding of that sector here in Brazil? Our support is actually indirect, and as most of the Brazilian agriculture, and this was also said by other speakers in the first panel, since most of it is used to export, so either to China or to other regions. So we have been trying to work with financing to funding infrastructures that are in these international chains of outflows of commodities and exchange of resources among countries. So warehousing, for example, storage, according to more recent data, Brazil has a capacity of storing 40% of its agricultural production. So when there is a very productive crop, or probably when you have excessive production or lack of grains, Brazilian farmers and exporters simply cannot manage these variations and fluctuations through stocks. And to have stocks and to manage warehousing, you need long-term funding. So this is a concern we have been working with, looking for longer term lines of credit for 10, 12 years that could provide the farmers with the possibility of funding these infrastructures that would contribute to the efficiency of the export chains. Ports have this same effect, and roads as well. So that has been the focus of our activities. And it's important to say, Claudia, that in the assessment of this infrastructure, the bank also adds social and environmental components. So we have established indicators. For example, in the case of infrastructure, you have agricultural commodities and you have origin indicators, and you know how much production was there in how many regions, so that we can support initiatives that are compatible with sustainability and environment uh, concerns. So that's how where we have been trying to act. Thank you, Mauricio. We have a comment and a question from Omar Rosler, and he said that in the southern part of the country, they are working to make feasible the organic production of wine and byproducts of vineyards and grapes. So, but we still can't quite see proper credit lines for this production. Well, unfortunately, Jaime from Banco do Brasil, which would be the most adequate person to answer this question, had to leave because he had a meeting. And I'd like to check with Luiz Augusto from UBM, or Shao from Bank of China, or Tassiano have something to comment on this part. Claudia, indeed, this is not a market we have any activity with, but there are no restrictions. I'll pass this question to our commercial area so that we can follow up on that. Since Jaime left the meeting, I would like to call José Ângelo Nascimento from the Ministry of Agriculture. He's still here with us, and there are some questions that I believe he could answer. And José Ângelo, we also have a question about whether, well, I don't know, I think it can be directed to the Ministry of Agriculture as well. The question is whether there are any programs to incentivize regenerative agriculture, such as agroforestry systems. As I said in my last intervention, we have the plan ABC, which is an umbrella plan for these practices. Everything that has to do with integration between forestry activities and crops, cattle raising, and agriculture. So these integrative practices are within this plan, and there are lines of credit that support the execution of these projects. So we certainly have that. But as I said at first, my activity is much dedicated to private financing. So if there is interest to talk more specifically about government-based lines, for example, the Safra plan, the ABC program, so we can have a specific event on that. I can organize this a specific event on that if you're interested. And there's another question that could be answered by you as well, which is, what is the percentage of soybean production which is produced by small farmers? Well, I don't have that number on mine right now. We have some good proxies, because even within the PRONAFE program, which is a program that provides credit to family farming, soybean production is very relevant, actually. So we have indeed farmers of all sizes in Brazil. farming soybeans, and we can have a dedicated conversation. I don't have the number, but we need to define what small farmers are. We need to decide on what are the small farmers. We have a secretariat that addresses that. So we have the family farming secretariat, and the agricultural policy secretary is here with me as well. He's helping me to answer. And we have a specific secretariat to address family farming and small farmers, and they can help us as well. And about the other question, Claudia, these regenerative questions and systems, integrative systems, in Brazil, that is not a pilot anymore or a case. We actually have 17 million hectares in Brazil of rural undertakings that adopt formal practices that integrate forest with crops and cattle raising livestock and pastures. And this is quite a large area, and it's probably outdated. It's 1 year old, this piece of data, but we have a network for this integration of crops, pastures, and forests. And if you want, we can organize specific workshops for these topics of interest. We can bring farmers associations, Embrapa, researchers, private institutions. We can tailor make it for you. So we can really bring that forward if you want to get to know our agribusiness. There is a question from Hao Biaochang from the Agricultural Bank of China about environmental monitoring of rural properties in China and the use of technology as well. And how does that take place? Is there an electronic registry of rural properties in China? So Hui Biao, you have the floor. Claudia, I would like to answer. Okay, Dr. Ma Jung, would you like to answer the question? Yes, I will reply. I cannot give you a very complete answer, but I can give you an overview of how we are how we stand in terms of digitization. In our institution, together with the Washington Institute, we've published a report on the use of digital data to sustainable projects. So we had 90 cases, and we saw how they were used. In agriculture, I didn't participate personally in this project, so I don't have all of the details, but I can give you an overview. In the southern part of China, which is more advanced, they are already working with digital technologies for tea plant crops and fertilizers and digital systems. And there is a data platform which is ready for tracking, and we can calculate if there are any waste products, and if they go over and if they can be considered organic or not. There's a standard in China, and the emissions need to be below a certain number to be considered organic, and a percentage that needs to be considered. So it's quite below this threshold, and this is to guarantee that the product is organic and can be marketed at higher prices with higher added value. So tea plants from other regions would not be sold and fraud in fraudulent manners, saying that they are organic when they're not. So we have an official recognition of organic certification so that they can sell it in a different higher added value. So they use this platform as a consultation to make the loans, because we know that with these data, we have a guarantee. And I can provide lower interest loans. And this is also a guarantee for us when giving a loan.
Thank you, Dr. Majung. One question that has been brought by Shao was the standardization or the adoption of a unified taxonomy. While taking the opportunity of Dr. Majun with us, I'd like to ask him, what does Brazil and China, what can Brazil and China do to advance in the creation of a unified taxonomy of standards that would allow the funding to agricultural funding to be more fluid? Well, the unification of the standard and the discussions in the latest years, well, yeah, that's what we're having. And we have worked more intensively with the European Union, that we're using the common ground taxonomy. And I'm representing China in this work. It has been 2 years, and we have reached a consensus of a taxonomy China European Union with 72 items, including agriculture items recognized by both parties, China and European Union. In the past months that we have advanced, 4 bonds in China for the European market has been issued. So that experience perhaps can be replicated with Brazil. Perhaps we don't need to use all the items, because for all of these items we use, it took us 2 years with the European Union. And perhaps it would be interesting to have an exclusive taxonomy or to be recognized by the 2 countries bilaterally, Brazil and China. This is something being built together. We can start with a single product, with a specific one, and choose one and develop over this product. So it has worked in the import and the add value, and we create this seal, this label, in fact. And for this seal to be recognized as a high quality product. And perhaps the government and they put a policy of benefits where on the different taxation. And the financial institution as well. If they have this label being that for soy or meat, if they can have a lower interest for the ones that has this bilateral label, the high quality Brazil, China. So this is a discussion that we need to have if it's the interest of all, for the Brazilian producers, for the conservation of the Brazilian environment. Is it of interest of the Chinese producers to have a better quality product and green products? If there is interest of all these parties, we can start this type of work. Thank you. Luiz Augusto, Tassiano, Shao, José Ângelo, do you have more comments on that? Because it's important to bring this taxonomy in the construction of common standards and how that can be done. I believe it's fundamental because currently the market has a high level of entropy. What does sustainability mean on this or that activity? Well, that will depend on efforts such as the one that Dr. Majun is bringing, because we see we are very excited with this type of initiative, and should that be necessary, or perhaps, my sense of urgency is always high for me. If yesterday this was done, for me it would be better. So to have a bilateral taxonomy. So and I believe the use of that will transcend this bilateral relationship. The more consistent it is, it may be used in different relations. I only see benefits on that, and I'm certain that would not start from scratch. A lot has already been done, and what we must do is the consumer market, investor market, to understand what do you want us to prove, and we'll prove it. Whatever is necessary to adjust, we'll do so. So I'll take that to the secretary, the suggestion of Dr. Majung, and to see if we can give traction to this initiative. Thank you. Tassiano, and then Shao. I share the view of my colleague José Ângelo. I am certain there is a convergency, a very positive one, right, in terms of taxonomy between Brazil and China. The practices that the rural producers in Brazil establish, such as no tillage, the use of fertilizers. There is a strong trend that we see at Rabobank, the use of biofertilizers, the balance of chemical fertilizers, and this brings gains to the rural producers. Those are opportunities that we have within our countries. So I am certain this can surpass the boundary between the Brazil-China relationship to other commercial relations, and to establish more potential for the funding of the Brazilian agribusiness. So fully aligned with the José Ângelo and Dr. Majum. I am. Shao? I agree. I share the idea and opinions of my colleague Cassiano and José and Dr. Majum. And just to call the attention that the Bank of China, for instance, follows strictly in their international loans the taxonomy presented by Dr. Majum of this common grounded taxonomy, which is an effort from China together with the European Union. But with regards to the bilateral taxonomy, I believe we could think a bit more internationally, not only restricted to the region, because the European Union is a large buyer of the agribusiness products from Brazil. If we could join together China, European Union, and Brazil, would be the best scenario possible, because you don't need to work differently, and you would definitely facilitate the work in the syndicated loans, and more investors, international banks would participate in this joint initiative. So I believe it would be interesting for Brazil, European Union, and China in this initiative, this taxonomy initiative. Thank you, Shao. José Ângelo, for the last comment before we close our panel. I agree with Dr. Sheng, and we have CBI. CBI perhaps may be the joining of forces between Brazil and China, and we have just signed an understanding with them, so it has been a very fruitful work. So we can have this triangle or triple effort and we can establish international standards with the colleagues. Tassiano, he agreed with us, that can be used in other relations. I'm excited. Thank you, José Ângelo. Perhaps we could stay hours in this chat, but our time is almost up. I'd like to thank José Ângelo, Dr. Majun, and all the participants of this panel, Mauricio, Jaime, that is not with us, and YB Chang, Shao Bashan, Luiz Augusto, Tassiano, and I hope I can see you in the future in other events of CBC. And I kindly ask you, you can cut your video and sound, and please, only Dr. Majung will stay with us for the closing words. And I'd like to invite also Ambassador Luiz Augusto Castro Neves, the president of CBC, to close today's event. Dr. Majung. Thank you, Claudia. I'd like to thank the participants. We have been together for 3 hours, over 100 participants together with us in this dialogue on sustainable agriculture, Brazil, China, with different results. Talking about the finance, what I have written down is 4 points that I'd like to mention in this conclusion. The sustainable finance needs a taxonomy and indicators, or unified taxonomy and indicators. Each country has their own, but there is no mutual recognition to that. So we need international cooperation to have mutual recognition. The sustainable agriculture requires an assessment system that is, well, more efficient on what is the impact that we're having on the environment, and more transparency if this is bringing benefits to the environment. The third point is government policies towards the promotion of sustainable agriculture, for the capital of civil society to be directed to these activities, being internal or domestic or international capital. We have different examples, such as the central bank in China. They have tools with lower interests, with lower carbon, I mean, to foster this transformation and with more simplified guarantees. So I believe other countries could have that as reference. And the carbon market may be a very important mechanism on that sort. It may be restricted to the internal market. For instance, in China now, there are 17 regions and one of them is unified. So we are preparing to add that to the international carbon market. And this is being divided for forests, agriculture, livestock, and different categories that will be added to the market. And we must develop also our financial products now. We have bonds, loans, and different practices linked to sustainable practices. But we must consider also other possibilities to have this leverage. Only loans, that's not enough. And to use the whole chain to decrease the risk of small producers, the traceability, and to be used as data for the financial institutions. And finally, I'd like to emphasize the suggestions that everybody's excited, which is the creation of a unified taxonomy in the Brazil-China agriculture. So I'd like to invite the experts to participate in this work in the dialogue among authorities that can be deepened to be able to support the unification of taxonomy, and that includes the Chinese authorities, the Brazilian authorities as well, to provide this support to this work that we have brought up. And then we can add this work to within the BRICS countries, because the BRICS countries, it is a space that may be developed. So if we are successful in this work, we can bring this taxonomy to the BRICS countries. That's what I wanted to share. And now I pass the floor to Ambassador Neves. Thank you very much to you all, ladies and gentlemen. As you've seen in this meeting, there are different fronts of cooperation between Brazil and China in low carbon agriculture. I'd like to thank all speakers for the great contributions to this debate, and IFS and Majung and their team for the partnership in this event. This event, as well, besides the fronts detected, open new future cooperation fronts. In behalf of CBC, I'd like to thank once again the fundamental support of Bayer to the second dialogue Brazil-China on sustainable agriculture. And I'd like to mention that today's event will be made available timely in Portuguese, Chinese, and English in the CBC channel on YouTube. Thank you, all of you, ladies and gentlemen, and good morning to the ones in Brazil, good evening, good night to the ones in China. See you next time.